Good evening, everyone. My name is Karen Kay, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Illinois chapter of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. Welcome to this evening's educational webinar, New Approaches to Healthy Eating with IBD. This is a My IBD learning program in partnership with the University of Chicago Medicine IBD Center. We are grateful for their incredible support, leadership, and unwavering commitment to the mission of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. I would like to thank all of you for joining us to better understand the challenges of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. The foundation is committed to empowering IBD patients to take charge of their care. Research has demonstrated that engagement with organizations such as ours results in increased disease knowledge and resilience, which has consistently correlated with better health outcomes for patients. I hope you leave us this evening having learned a new approach to help you manage your disease, new insights and questions to bring to your healthcare team, and certainly a bit more hope for the future. Thank you. The mission of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation is to find a cure for the Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and to improve the quality of life for children and adults living with these diseases. We cannot achieve this mission without funding critical research projects. The foundation has invested over $400 million into finding the causes, treatments, and cures for these diseases. And we will not stop until we realize our vision of a future free from Crohn's and colitis. We are only able to accomplish this through the generosity and engagement of individuals deeply invested in finding better treatments and cures. There are many ways for you all to become involved with the foundation across the country and right here in Illinois. You'll receive an email following this follow-up after this particular webinar, which will contain the recording, as well as some contact information and a link to the Illinois chapter website, where you can learn more about all of our educational programs, some support groups that are local here in Illinois, a link to the national website, and any special events that are happening in our state. And we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and engage with the organization. Now, I just have a few housekeeping items, as always. Before I introduce our esteemed speaker, I'd like to share a few reminders before we begin. We have quite a large group here joining us this evening, and we are very pleased about that. So you've all been muted for this particular webinar, but we will be taking questions. The presentation will be recorded and accessible to view after the completion of tonight's program. If you have any questions throughout the program, please type them into the Q&A box at any time throughout this program. We will then address questions after our speaker. So without any further wait, I am honored to introduce tonight's featured speaker, Courtney Schuchmann. Ms. Schuchmann is a registered dietitian at the University of Chicago Medical Center. She completed her dietetic internship and master's degree in clinical nutrition at Rush University before going on and joining the University of Chicago Digestive Disease team. Her clinical practice specializes in providing medical nutrition therapy to a variety of individuals with gastrointestinal disorders, such as inflammatory bowel disease, celiac disease, esophagitis, irritable bowel disease, and weight management. She is an active member of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and a registered dietitian inflammatory bowel disease practice group. Courtney has a strong passion for food and enjoys sharing her knowledge about nutrition to help shape healthy and sustainable lifestyles that improve the quality of life for her patients. Courtney, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us this evening. I will go ahead and turn over the floor to you.
All right, so hopefully you can all hear and see me okay. Thank you so much for the gracious introduction. As you have already heard, my name is Courtney Schuchmann. I am one of the IBD dietitians at the University of Chicago Medical Center. Today, I will be talking to you a little bit about some alternative approaches to healthy eating with IBD. So the objectives for tonight's presentation is we will talk about the difference between inflammatory foods, which are certain foods when consumed frequently could contribute to inflammation, compared to or versus trigger foods, which might contribute to symptoms with individuals with inflammatory bowel disease. We will also discuss ways for reducing your intake of inflammatory foods by finding alternatives that could promote better health, as well as develop skills to modify your diet to minimize trigger foods if these do contribute to symptoms for you. And then lastly, we will discuss the potential of over-restrictive and or disordered eating behaviors in IBD and ways to have a more flexible approach to eating. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, the cause of inflammatory bowel disease is unclear, and it's likely multifactorial, meaning a lot of different components play into the development of IBD. Diet is potentially one of these factors that could play a role in the development of inflammation in IBD. Research suggests that certain diets and dietary patterns can weaken the intestinal barrier, disrupt the gut microbiome, ultimately contributing to the development of inflammation and potentially the development of IBD. The studies or dietary patterns frequently linked to potential inflammation and IBD are the westernized diet, which is a diet characterized by high intake of animal fats and added sugar and low consumption of fiber from fruits and vegetables. It's also been suggested that high calorie or excessive caloric intake, which contributes to overweight and obesity, can contribute to inflammation and IBD. And then diets that are characterized by high consumption of food additives, so excessive consumption of processed foods or ultra processed foods could play a role in inflammation and IBD. So while diet does not cause IBD, diet is a potential modifiable risk factor, which you may be able to manipulate to help control or reduce your risk of inflammatory bowel disease. So studies suggest, like I said, westernized diet, which is characterized by high consumption of added sugars like desserts and sweets, processed meats, red meats, and processed foods, and low consumption of fruits, vegetables, legumes, and whole grains could contribute to inflammation. Whereas on the opposite stand, there's the Mediterranean diet, which has frequently been associated with reduced risk of IBD. It's also potentially been shown to help reduce inflammation in individuals who have inflammatory bowel disease. So the Mediterranean diet is characterized by high consumption of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and minimal consumption of red meat, processed meat, and added sugars. And then foods such as low-fat dairy products, legumes, eggs, and seafood are incorporated in moderation. It's also important to note that the Mediterranean lifestyle strongly encourages the inclusion of physical activity, movement, and socialization with eating. So this is a great slide that outlines some of the recommendations from the IO-IBD consensus, which is a big group of IBD experts who provided some guidelines on foods that could potentially be prudent in the diet for individuals with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. So certain foods could potentially increase inflammation and worsen disease outcomes or contribute to the development of IBD, whereas some could actually be protective. So they have suggested that individuals with Crohn's increase their intakes of fruits and vegetables. Not only are these foods high in fiber, which is more conducive to a balanced dietary pattern like the Mediterranean style of eating, but fruits and vegetables also contain these antioxidants, which have a lot of additional health benefits. For individuals with ulcerative colitis, it's been recommended that you increase your intake of omega-3 rich foods, so omega-3 oils and fatty fishes. They also suggest for patients with UC that you limit or reduce your consumption of red meat and processed meat and dairy fats, palm, and coconut oil, which contain myristic acid, which could potentially increase risk for flare for individuals with UC. And for both individuals with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, the IO-IBD organization recommends limiting your consumption of food additives such as carrageenan, emulsifiers, maltodextrin, and titanium oxide, and minimizing your intake of saturated and trans fats. So ultimately, a good takeaway is that many of the diets that are frequently suggested to be beneficial for individuals with IBD, like the Crohn's disease exclusion diet, the Mediterranean diet, the SCD diet, or the IBD-A diet, all have a similar component in play, and that's that they are a whole food, predominantly plant-based dietary pattern. So a lot of these diets minimize consumption of these food additives, artificial sweeteners, and emulsifiers because they strongly encourage including more whole foods. So how do you reduce your intake of inflammatory foods? I think it's really important to understand that while these foods could contribute to inflammation, that's when they're consumed in excess or consumed on a frequent basis. Occasional consumption of some of these inflammatory foods likely does not contribute to the development of inflammatory bowel disease. However, if you are someone that consumes a lot of these foods or food additives on a regular basis, you might want to try making some modifications to your diet to reduce your consumption of these foods. So in an effort to reduce your intake of red meat and processed meat, you can try to incorporate more plant-based proteins. So beans, lentils, tofu, nuts, seeds, and nut and seed butters. Not only does this help reduce your intake of red meat and processed meat, it also increases your fiber intake, which I have previously mentioned is a beneficial component of the diet for individuals with IBD. You can also try reducing red meat and processed meat by alternating with poultry products like skinless chicken and turkey breast, seafood like fish, shellfish, and omega-3 rich fatty fishes. In an effort to reduce your intake of full-fat dairy products, try choosing low-fat dairy like non-fat Greek yogurt or low-fat kefir. You can also try swapping butter and vegetable oils, which can contain some of those inflammatory fats, for beneficial fats such as extra virgin olive oil. And ultimately, when choosing convenience foods, try to find foods that are minimally processed. So look for foods with a simplistic ingredient list. You'll notice on this slide, there's two different brands of peanut butter listed. So one of them, the only ingredients are peanuts and salt. And the other one, not only is there peanuts and salt, there's also the addition of sugar and some hydrogenated vegetable oils that could potentially be inflammatory if consumed on a regular basis. So I think it's important to take note of the ingredient list and food labels when purchasing products and trying to compare them and find options that are maybe a little bit more of a minimal ingredient list. So good examples are cottage cheese, nut butters, and applesauce. These can frequently contain some of those inflammatory additives that were mentioned on the previous slide. So try to find brands that have less of those components. You can also try including homemade versions of these where you have a little bit more control over the ingredients. So almond milk and salad dressing, which commonly contain carrageenan, you can prepare at home. A simple recipe for salad dressing is the combination of vinegar and olive oil with a squirt of mustard and seasonings. You can also try making your own mayo and using unsweetened yogurt and sweetening it at home with a little bit of date syrup or fruit for more of a natural sweetener. So it's important to understand the difference between foods that could potentially be inflammatory, so contributing to gut inflammation, compared to trigger foods, which are different. So trigger foods are foods that can commonly cause GI symptoms for individuals with IBD. So these might contribute to feelings of abdominal pain, cramping, gas, bloating, and changes in your bowel habits like constipation and diarrhea. So these are some of the common dietary triggers that we're going to review. And like I said, it's important to understand that not all of these foods are actually driving inflammation. A lot of times they contribute to symptoms, but they actually are not causing inflammation in the gut. So for example, fiber, as I've already mentioned a few times, is a beneficial component of the diet. It's been shown to help reduce risks of flares and reduce the risk of developing IBD. However, fiber is a common dietary trigger for a lot of patients with IBD, especially during active disease. Therefore, it's important to try manipulating fibrous foods to improve your tolerance. So removing skins and seeds, cooking them to fork tender, and pureeing or blending when possible to help break down the fiber particle and make it more tolerable. This is also really beneficial for individuals who have stricturing or narrowing in the intestines, where fiber could potentially increase your risk for obstruction. So manipulating fiber can be a beneficial way of incorporating these foods with a low risk of an obstruction. So some examples of how to incorporate fruits: you can try blending them into smoothies, blending fruits to add to yogurt, oatmeal, or spreading on toast like a pureed jam, peeling and baking fruits like apples, peaches, and pears, and adding them to yogurt, oatmeal, or having as desserts. If you can't tolerate nuts and seeds, you can try doing nut and seed butters or baking with nut flours to still get the nutritional value of those foods. To incorporate beans, you can try blending them into soups or pureeing them into dips like hummus or your own version of a refried bean. And then for vegetables, try cooking them into soups. So vegetables that are cooked for prolonged periods of time in a broth tend to be a lot softer and easier to digest. You can also try peeling and roasting them, blending vegetables into soup. So cauliflower and frozen zucchini actually work really well in smoothies. Puree vegetables into sauces, which you can use for pasta, or you can use these vegetable purees for a sauce on top of eggs, chicken, fish, and turkey. And you can also try blending things like roasted vegetables and beans into spreads, which you can use on sandwiches and wraps. Therefore, you're getting a good diversity of fiber-rich foods while also helping improve your tolerance of these foods. So this is a great example of how you can incorporate some of these foods depending on where your disease activity is. So for individuals in a flare, you might want to stay in this first column with more of the pureed versions of fruits and vegetables and fibrous foods. But as your disease activity improves and you are in remission, you may be able to work your way up to incorporating more of the raw roughage. So raw fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, and popcorn. A lot of times patients with IBD think they have to avoid fiber or be on a low fiber diet indefinitely, but studies suggest that that's not beneficial actually. Some individuals, like those with stricturing or narrowing, may have to modify their fiber so that they don't develop an obstruction, but for many individuals, once your disease activity is well managed, you may be able to increase your fiber intake. Lactose is another common dietary trigger amongst those with IBD. Lactose is the carbohydrate, so the sugar that's in dairy products. However, it's not present in all dairy products. So a common myth is that individuals have to eliminate dairy to help reduce their symptoms with dairy products. However, reducing your intake of lactose, which is common in milk, yogurt, ice cream, and then soft cheeses like ricotta cheese and cottage cheese are typically the ones that tend to provoke more symptoms for patients. However, there's plenty of dairy products that are low to no lactose, such as hard cheeses, lactose-free milk, kefir, lactose-free yogurt, and Greek yogurt are great options that tend to be pretty well tolerated for individuals with lactose intolerance. It's also important to note that by eliminating lactose, if you eliminate dairy products altogether, you're actually missing out on a lot of beneficial nutrients. So dairy is a great source of calcium, B vitamins, protein, and probiotics, which we know play an important role in just overall health management. It's also important to note that when choosing dairy products, try to choose low-fat dairy products when possible to help reduce your intake of saturated fat and that myristic acid, which could potentially be inflammatory in individuals with ulcerative colitis. If you do have to eliminate dairy entirely for other health-related reasons, you want to make sure that you're incorporating adequate calcium in your diet. So green leafy vegetables, seeds, sardines or salmon with bones, beans and lentils, certain nuts, tofu, and fortified dairy alternatives are great ways to make sure that you're still getting enough calcium, as calcium is really important for individuals with IBD. Another common dietary trigger is alcohol. So a lot of people report that alcohol worsens their symptoms when they have quiescent disease, so they're in remission, and when they're in a flare. However, a lot of individuals, even without IBD, report that alcohol does contribute to some gastrointestinal symptoms. And this could be because alcohol can be a gut irritant, which can drive symptoms for a lot of individuals. Alcohol in large quantities could potentially be inflammatory too. So it's important to note that if you do decide to consume alcohol, that you're consuming it in moderation. Alcohol can also contribute to worsened dehydration. So a lot of individuals with IBD, like those with ileostomies, or if you have active IBD, you might be already at an increased risk for dehydration due to high output or frequent diarrhea. So alcohol could worsen dehydration. So ultimately, if you decide to consume alcohol, try to consume it in moderation. For women, this is 1 or fewer drinks per day and no more than 2 drinks per day for men. Also make sure to stay hydrated if you are drinking alcohol, and that is alternating 8 ounces of water per every alcoholic beverage you consume. High-fat foods are another frequently reported dietary trigger. It's important to understand that not all fats are created equal. As I previously mentioned, myristic acid, which is in palm oil, coconut oil, and dairy fats, could potentially be inflammatory for individuals specifically with ulcerative colitis. However, on the other hand, omega-3 fatty acids, which are another type of fat, have been shown to be beneficial or anti-inflammatory. The inclusion of extra virgin olive oil, which is a key component of the Mediterranean diet, has been shown to be beneficial. However, many times individuals with active IBD may report increased symptoms with high fat intake. So you may have to modify the fat content of your meals to help reduce some of those symptoms. So try limiting or avoiding greasy, oily, and fried foods, and choose alternative preparation methods like baked, grilled, boiled, or lightly sauteed versions. You can also try swapping high fat ingredients when preparing foods to help improve your tolerance and improve the nutritional value of the food. So swapping out applesauce for oil when baking, or trying low-fat Greek yogurt in place of things like sour cream, cream cheese, or mayo, which this is a great alternative this time of year when a lot of people are making dips for the holiday get-togethers. You can try swapping out like a non-fat or a low-fat Greek yogurt for some of those dairy-based alternatives that are higher in saturated fat. And then also trying to use pureed vegetable sauces, light pesto, or extra virgin olive oil in place of creamy sauces that might be served on things like pastas or protein-based dishes. Spicy and acidic foods are also foods that are frequently reported by individuals with IBD as worsening symptoms. So these are commonly associated with worse symptoms, specifically during a flare, and they can also contribute to worse symptoms of reflux or GERD. So a lot of times patients with IBD may also have some of these upper GI symptoms like acid reflux. If you notice that spicy foods and acidic foods worsen some of your symptoms, there's some ways to modify your diet to still allow for a good variety and versatility while reducing your symptoms. So some swaps for acidic foods like tomato-based sauces on pizza and pasta, you could try choosing extra virgin olive oil or pesto, and you can also try incorporating a pureed winter squash. So butternut squash is a great option where you can puree it, add seasoning, and you can use this as a sauce for pizza, pasta, and you can also use this as the base for soups and stews. You can also try swapping citrus fruits like oranges, pineapple, grapefruit for non-citrus fruits like melon, banana, berries, and apples. It's important to understand that if you are cutting back on acidic foods, sometimes this can result in inadequate intake of vitamin C rich foods. So working with your medical team is important to make sure that you're choosing alternative foods to make sure you're still getting a balanced intake of all the nutrients your body needs. If spicy foods worsen your symptoms, you can try reducing the intake of those spicy additives like chili powder, jalapeno, hot sauce, and cayenne pepper by using smaller volumes in recipes, or choosing alternatives like herbs and spices such as basil, oregano, thyme, ginger, turmeric, cumin, and cinnamon, which could potentially actually have anti-inflammatory effects. Sugar and sweeteners can also be a potential dietary trigger for individuals with IBD. High sucrose intake, which is table sugar, has actually been shown to increase inflammation and risk for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's. Excess sugar has also potentially been shown to worsen symptoms for a lot of patients with IBD when they're in active flare. So it's important to understand that certain types of sugar might be worse tolerated, such as fermentable sugars like honey, agave, and high fructose corn syrup, which could drive worse symptoms for some individuals. However, take caution when looking for sugar-free alternatives. Sometimes these contain artificial sweeteners, which I previously mentioned could potentially be inflammatory if consumed regularly. Or they could contain sugar alcohols as a sugar-free alternative, which actually could worsen symptoms for a lot of patients with IBD. So ultimately, if you're trying to reduce your intake of sugar and sweeteners, try limiting candy, cookies, pastries, juices, and desserts. Try using table sugar in moderation, or try swaps like honey if you can tolerate it, date syrup, maple syrup, applesauce, or fruit to naturally sweeten foods. And then if you're someone that frequently consumes juice and sugar-sweetened drinks like pop and sports drinks, maybe try opting for infused water infused with fruits, vegetables, and herbs, or using herbal teas. And then ultimately, like I previously mentioned, try to avoid foods and drinks sweetened with artificial sweeteners and sugar alcohols. The biggest takeaway, though, is not everyone's dietary triggers are the same. IBD looks very different from one patient to the next, and therefore what causes symptoms for you might not be the same for someone else with inflammatory bowel disease. So try to modify your diet without completely restricting or avoiding an entire food group. This is where working with a dietitian can be really helpful, because if you notice certain foods exacerbate your symptoms, you can find alternatives to make sure your diet is still balanced without becoming overly restricted. Trigger foods may only need to be limited temporarily for some individuals during a flare. So try reintroducing these foods as your disease activity improves and your symptoms are better managed. When reintroducing foods, start low, so small quantities, and increase the volume slowly over time to test your tolerance. And the biggest takeaway is just because certain foods worsen your symptoms and they trigger symptoms, this does not mean that these foods are actually driving inflammation. Certain inflammatory foods could cause symptoms for some patients with IBD, but a lot of foods actually that could drive inflammation cause no symptoms at all. So same with vice versa. Those foods that are triggering symptoms might not be inflammatory. And lastly, I wanted to really briefly touch on how to avoid overly restricting your diet. It's very common with IBD to modify your diet as a means for controlling your symptoms. However, sometimes this can be taken too far, which can result in very restrictive dieting. So what are some signs of an overly restricted diet? Eliminating entire food groups. If you look at your diet and there's a whole grouped category missing, such as dairy has been eliminated, or fruits, or vegetables, or nuts and seeds, or beans, this can be a sign that your diet has become overly restricted and might be lacking in some nutrients. Other signs could be avoiding social engagement that involves food and eating. So if you're no longer going to socialized events such as family gatherings or friend gatherings or work-related events that centralize around food, this can be a sign that your diet has become overly restricted. And then constant preoccupation with food or feelings of guilt and shame after eating can be indications of some disordered eating. So the development of disordered eating can sometimes occur as we modify our diet with IBD, and this can result in over-restriction, which could put you at risk for developing an eating disorder. Disordered eating and eating disorders are common in individuals with gastrointestinal disorders and with IBD. And they can impact your psychosocial factors such as anxiety, depression, stress, which are common when you've really restricted your diet. They can also greatly impact your quality of life. They can also contribute to nutrient deficiencies, unintentional weight loss, and malnutrition, which is already really common for patients with IBD. So what can you do to reduce your risk of overly restricting your diet? Keep in mind that all foods in moderation can be a part of a balanced diet. So even some of those foods that could potentially be inflammatory, remember that's in large quantities on a frequent basis. Every once in a while, consuming these foods likely is not going to contribute to inflammation. Just like trigger foods, so certain foods that might provoke symptoms, sometimes it may be worth it for some individuals to improve their mental health or their quality of life to just enjoy in the moment and have those foods, despite the fact that they might result in some symptoms. Keep in mind that your mental health is just as important as your physical health. If you feel like your diet has greatly impacted your mental health, it's important to ask your IBD team for help. And ultimately, there are other non-dietary therapies that can be utilized to manage your symptoms. So gut-directed hypnotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, pelvic floor physical therapy. These are all approaches that don't require modifying or restricting your diet that could potentially help improve your symptoms. And work with your multidisciplinary team. An IBD dietitian can help make sure that your diet is balanced and help you find swaps or alternatives for foods that you might be avoiding for various reasons. And seek help from a mental health expert if you think this would be beneficial. We're fortunate enough, we have a GI psychologist on our team who is extremely beneficial to the management of gut-related disorders, especially the relationship between food, eating, and IBD. And if you feel like your diet has become extremely restricted, or you might have disordered eating or an eating disorder, it's important to work with an eating disorder specialist to ensure the right treatment. And then this is the contact information for the University of Chicago scheduling. If you are interested in meeting with an IBD dietitian such as myself, you can schedule by calling this number. And now I think we're going to open it up to some questions.
We will. Thank you, Courtney, very much. We really appreciate you sharing. That was a ton of information for us. So thank you very, very much. I know we definitely have some questions. So I will now ask Annie Gonberg, who is the director of the University of Chicago Medicine IBD Center, to lead our Q&A session. Annie, thank you for being here with us tonight. We really appreciate that. And I turn the floor over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen. This is just an amazing, what a wonderful resource our Illinois chapter for the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation is. And you and Kelly have been so phenomenal in helping us get this started. Courtney, just every time I hear you talk, you're amazing and wonderful. And I can't believe that I get to just like text you all day long with my dietary concerns and questions. But just to get right into it, I was reviewing the questions that we have coming in from the audience, and there's the big. I think there's one that's kind of a big question, which is fiber. You mentioned fiber in your presentation, and one of our attendees says that my doctor says no nuts or seeds or corn for Crohn's disease. Are you saying it's okay? And then also, what fibers are safe to consume if you do have stricturing disease? Are there different kinds of fibers? Are there concerns about ileostomy that we should be concerned about and thinking about? So maybe, I know that's a lot, so that might be a whole webinar in and of itself, but if you could maybe speak a little bit more about fiber.
Yeah, I think fiber is the most discussed nutrient of concern when it comes to IBD. And there are different types of fiber. So there's insoluble fiber. So this is the skins of fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and more of like that roughness. It acts more as like a rake in the colon. And this is the type of fiber that increases risk for obstruction. So it doesn't break down well, and it could potentially get stuck for some people with stricturing. Soluble fiber, on the other hand, is more like a gel. So it absorbs water in the gut, and it's a lower risk for an obstruction, and it tends to be better tolerated. So soluble fiber is the insides of your fruits and vegetables. So these tend to be safer options for patients with active IBD or for those with stricturing. However, it really comes down to the particle size. So when you think about nut butters, for a lot of individuals with ostomies or stricturing, peanut butter, almond butter, they tend to be fine, and they're actually frequently recommended. They contain the exact same amount of fiber as a serving of nuts. The only difference is that they're completely blended, which makes the fiber fully broken down and better to tolerate or less likely to obstruct. So use that same concept when incorporating other fibrous foods like fruits and vegetables. If they're in a blended or a pureed variety and there's no chunks or seeds or big pieces, it likely is going to be well tolerated with active disease, stricturing, ostomies. With ostomies, you might have to take in some other considerations because certain things might contribute to higher output. But usually by manipulating the fiber, it tends to be well tolerated. So it's not that you have to be on a low fiber diet with IBD. You might just have to modify or manipulate the fiber to improve the tolerance of those foods.
That makes a lot of sense, especially if you think about the structure of and how IBD can affect through scar tissue and other things, the structure of the bowel itself. We have some other questions about additives, specifically soy lecithin, which I think you mentioned in your presentation, and also stevia, which is, I know, a natural sweetener. That's not really an additive, that's a different piece. But what about those two specific, since we do have specific questions about that? Soy lecithin, what is that and how does it work, and should we avoid it?
Yeah, so the soy lecithin is actually an emulsifier that's frequently used. The IO-IBD guidelines did not specifically indicate that emulsifier. However, it is an additive in a lot of processed foods. So by just reducing your intake of ultra-processed foods, you tend to reduce your consumption of these foods. So I think a good question to ask is this a food that you could potentially prepare at home where it doesn't contain some of those additives? And that might be a better approach to managing this. However, consuming things like soy lecithin or stevia, or even some of the other emulsifiers or artificial sweeteners in moderation likely is fine. It's in large volumes that it could potentially become more inflammatory. So it's important to understand that over restriction and becoming extremely anxious around food because of some of these recommendations also isn't beneficial for your health.
Which is such an easy, and we talk about that all the time in support group. Every month we talk about how easy it is when food causes you pain to restrict your diet. So we had a question about, I think that the dairy question is really interesting. How do dairy, I mean, every time you go to Starbucks, there's a new nut milk. There's a lot of dairy substitutions, including coconut and all of the nut milks that are available. Are they good for, these are part of the anti-inflammatory group, or are they something that we should be mindful of, or is it really an individual thing?
So I think it's important to approach it from a standpoint of, why are you choosing these alternatives? They are not nutritionally equivalent to dairy-based products. So almond milk, for example, has 30 calories per cup and only 1 gram of protein, compared to milk, which is going to contain more calories, but it also contains protein. So a lot of times the dairy alternatives like nut milks or oat milk do not contain protein. They are frequently fortified with calcium and some of the other vitamins and minerals, but they're not a great alternative if you're looking for a protein option. So from a plant-based standpoint, something like a soy milk could be a better option where it provides more of a complete protein source. Also, it's important to note that a lot of the nut-based milk or dairy alternatives can also contain a lot of those additives that I previously mentioned, such as the emulsifiers, because nut milks like to separate usually. So in order to make them more of a shelf available option, emulsifiers are frequently added. So you can actually make almond milk at home. It's a very simple recipe of water and nuts, and you blend it and strain it. And that way it doesn't contain any of the additional additives. But so I kind of approach that from a few different standpoints. But also I think the lactose component is another reason that a lot of times people gravitate towards the nut-based version. So if that sits better with you when you're having something like a coffee, to have almond milk with it because you tolerate it better, that seems like a reasonable approach.
We had a couple questions about specific diets. How does a gluten-free diet, what does a gluten-free diet have to do with Crohn's, if anything?
So there is actually no strong evidence to support that a gluten-free diet is beneficial for the management of Crohn's disease. It has not been shown to influence inflammation with patients with IBD. A lot of the diets suggested to help with IBD management, like the SCD diet and the IBD-A diet, the low FODMAP diet, a lot of them have a gluten-free component. So a lot of times people extract this information and assume that a gluten-free diet is beneficial. However, the research has not supported that. A lot of times these studies have been shown that these diets could help with symptom control. So they might improve things like gas, bloating, stool variants in your consistency, like diarrhea, but they have not been shown to actually impact inflammation. So symptoms is different than inflammation. And right now, research does not suggest that a gluten-free diet plays a role in inflammation management with IBD.
But sometimes we do have patients that have both Crohn's disease and celiac disease, and that would be a time when a gluten-free diet would be necessary.
Absolutely. So anyone with celiac should be on a strict gluten-free diet for the treatment of celiac.
Which is, unfortunately, there is a larger than average overlap between those two conditions, IBD and celiac, which is interesting, and probably we will know more as research is done. This is kind of a cool question. Can trigger foods change, or do they mostly stay the same for patients over time? I've never thought about that.
Yeah,
thank you, participant.
They can ebb and flow, just like they frequently ebb and flow for individuals with IBS. Sometimes people realize that at one point in their life, they were absolutely fine with lactose, and then down the road, maybe they're no longer okay with lactose. So it can vary on a consistent basis for a lot of individuals, even those without IBD. However, during a flare, it's not uncommon to have worse trigger foods than when you're in remission. If your disease activity is really well controlled and there's no signs of inflammation, you might have something like a functional digestive disorder, like an overlap with IBS. And some of these individuals might notice that they have some ongoing trigger foods, even when their IBD is well controlled. So this is where a dietitian really comes into play as well, is helping you navigate disease activities controlled, but I'm still experiencing these symptoms that feel and look like a flare. How do I manage this from a dietary standpoint?
Thank you. We had a question. We've got just a couple more minutes. I just wanted to touch on this one more question about another question about fiber, which I think is really just telling, because we've been told, I think as IBD patients, all kinds of things about fiber from the beginning of your diagnosis. It's something we think about. So Metamucil or Restoralax or a fiber supplement, is that something you recommend for patients with IBD? Is that something that would help patients with IBD, or could it be possibly detrimental?
It's individualized. So in certain patients with IBD, such as those with ulcerative colitis who have undergone a J-pouch procedure, we do frequently use Metamucil to help with forming up stools and reducing frequency. Sometimes it's also used in individuals with ileostomies or colostomies to help manage the consistency of their output or the volume of their output. So it can be very well used in certain populations. It is soluble fiber. So again, that's the fiber that tends to be really well tolerated. It's frequently recommended. It gels in water. So if you've ever taken Metamucil and left it in a glass of water for too long, it gets gelatinous. So it's a very low risk for an obstruction. It tends to be well tolerated. However, everyone's individualized. I have plenty of patients who report worse gas and bloating sometimes with fiber supplements. So I think finding what works best for you is very individualized.
Thank you so much. We are right at our time. I think that we do need to wrap up, unfortunately. And I will thank Courtney again. When you were speaking about restrictive diets, it reminded me of something Gotham Reddy always said, which is that, like, he's a hepatologist who works with us, and he often says that it may not be great for the liver, but a burger and a beer is really good for the soul. And I think that we're all trying to find those balance, especially at this time of year when we are with our family, when we are in celebratory moods, when we're in settings where we're eating things we don't usually. And this is just really great guidance and just helps to illustrate the complexity of this condition and all the things that go into it. So thank you so much. And I will ask Karen maybe to wrap it up for us. Thank you so much, Courtney. You're amazing. Ugh, so lucky to have you.
Great. Courtney, thank you for your time, for your expertise, for your experience. We greatly appreciate it, greatly appreciate the partnership. You are incredibly knowledgeable, and I learned a lot. So I will bring that back to my family with those that have IBD. So I appreciate that. And Annie, thank you for serving tonight as our Q&A moderator. We very much appreciate the true partnership we have with the University of Chicago IBD Center and you, and we're so incredibly grateful for that in the Illinois chapter and at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. So thank you. And for everyone who joined us this evening, thank you so much. If you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, to connect with us online too as well. You'll receive an email afterwards with this recording that you could share if you would like, and then also to sign up for the newsletter or any additional information from the Illinois chapter. So, and I believe Courtney's phone number then was again posted, and it'll be in this presentation, as you know. So we thank you very much and look forward to seeing you again, and hope everyone has healthy and happy holidays. Thank you.